Today, we're going to talk about the second time that Jesus heals a person near a pool. What's the significance? And we're going to ask ourselves the question, are you blind to who Jesus is? Are you spiritually blind to the question of why did Jesus come? We're going to talk about that today when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Sherry Mangrum, and right away you probably noticed there's some changes. I wanted to ask your opinion. I'd love for you to comment and tell me what you think of my hat. I'm experimenting with wearing this, and I'm also growing a beard, but you don't have to comment on that. Anyway, let me know what you think. I'm looking forward to your comments.
I think it looks snazzy.
Snazzy. Okay. I don't even know how to spell snazzy. Today, we're going to be in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of John, and we're going to see some interesting things. This is going to go fairly quickly. We're going to see from verse 1 down to verse 34, and there's some interesting observations we can make in his recounting of this story. So let's get right into this, Sherry. Let's go from verse 1 down to verse 5.
As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? Jesus answered, It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the words of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world.
Okay, now, there's some interesting things here. Number one, this is not a conversation with the Jews yet. This is with the disciples. And they ask him a question of whether this blind man, who is blind from birth, whether he sinned or his parents sinned. And this is based upon Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, indicated that under the law, if the parents were not righteous, it would be visited upon the children, even to future generations. Now, they're not talking about birth defects or that sort of thing. It's being counted, and the ramifications of their unrighteous acts were going to affect the family. We see that today with parents that are not believers. They're going to raise their kids in an environment of disbelief and questioning, and that's going to be visited on those children, and the children at some point will have to break that pattern to change their lives. But that's the question the disciples are asking. That makes sense?
Yeah, and I can't help but think about the book of Job.
Yeah, and that this proves what they were saying about the law, that if somebody was hit with a hard time or birth defect or whatever, they must be a sinner.
Mm-hmm.
Job wasn't. That became clear. So this was an assumption on the tradition of the Jews that if a child was born with a birth defect, it must be because his parents were a sinner or he's a sinner. And it'd be like saying, well, he was born really doing terrible things. Okay. Now, we do know that they're born with a sin nature, but that's not what the Jews are saying here. The Jews were saying there must be something fundamentally wrong with this person or with their parents. Jesus immediately does away with that. Let's go back to this. He says in verse 3, it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. In other words, there's a plan to use his difficulty to glorify God. This works of God is an interesting phrase, because if you go to the next verse, he's talking to the disciples. He says, we must work the works of him who sent me. Notice, it doesn't say, I must work the works of him who sent me. He's talking to the disciples. And he's saying, we must work the works of him who sent me, the works of God who sent me,
Yes.
as long as it's called today. Night is coming, and this is the night of judgment. He says, after judgment comes, there's no possibility of doing God's work because it's too late. And then
I
he says,
wondered what that was referring to.
yeah, because you can't do missionary work at the judgment.
No.
Yeah, it's over. So he said, we must work the work of him who sent me now. Now, if you look at this, the works of him who sent me, look over at John chapter 6, verse 28 and 29.
Therefore, they said to him, what shall we do so that we may work the works of God? Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent.
Okay, so he's already said the works of God are giving the message so people believe in Jesus, the one who God sent. That's the works of God. So here he's saying again, the works of God, and he's basically saying, hey, we must work the works of God while it's still available, because
Mhm.
night is coming when nobody can work the works of God. It's going to
Mhm.
be too late.
I've
And
heard
then
all kinds of theories on that verse,
I think it's fairly clear what he's saying.
especially if you go down to the next verse.
The next, I'm here. I'm the light of the world while I'm here. And then when I leave and go to the cross, you're the light of the world. Remember those verses?
Yeah.
So we need to do the works of God, which are have people believe that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, who God sent to fulfill the mission plan of salvation for mankind. So that's our motivation there. That's the works of him who sent me, the works of God. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. But then that's not the point. But it fits into the kind of atmosphere of this message, because he's going to deal with blindness. And you have to have light before you can see in the dark. So now we're going to get into the story of the man. Where does he heal the man that was born blind?
He's in Jerusalem.
He's at the pool of Siloam. Pool of Siloam means sent. It's
Yes.
very interesting. Now, another interesting thing is this is the second time that Jesus has healed somebody at a pool.
Yeah.
Remember the pool of Bethsaida up in chapter 5,
Yeah.
where he healed the guy. And it's interesting here. We're going to see some differences. In chapter 5, he heals a guy on the Sabbath just by speaking to him. You're healed. Didn't do anything, didn't do any works. This day, on the Sabbath, he's going to heal a guy, and he's purposely going to do something. Okay, let's go back into these verses, because this is also a head scratcher. When he had said this, he spat on the ground, verse 6, and he made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. Now remember, I'm doing the works of him who sent me. And now for this guy to become no longer spiritually blind, he is going to be sent. All right?
Yeah.
So he went away and washed and came back seeing. Therefore, we'll come back to that whole thing about why he made the clay. But then there's a section, read 8 and 9.
Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the one.
Yeah, that's funny, because they basically asked 3 questions here. Number 1, what happened to this guy? How did it happen? And we're going to see this as it unfolds here. They said, now, this looks like the guy that was born blind. Now, remember, when somebody was born blind, God was judging the parents and judging them. and they were born blind. It wasn't a fact that they had a disease, the disease could be healed. One of the signs of Messiah was that he was going to be able to cure somebody who was born blind. And one of them was you got to bring back somebody from the dead. One of them was you have to cast out demons. But if a Messiah came along and said, hey, you were born blind, but now you can see, that was one of the signs of Messiah. So there's this kind of funny discussion here. It says, is this the guy who was born blind? He looks like the guy that was born blind. And in verse 9, it says, he kept saying, I'm the one that was born blind. In verse 10, they asked this question of how. So they were saying to him, how then were your eyes open? Because this was an amazing thing that he was born blind and now his eyes are open. How could that happen? And the answer is it's got to be the Messiah. But they're just basically saying, well, how in the world did that happen? And he answered, this man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? So that's the third question is, where? Okay.
They're asking him when he was blind before.
Yeah, exactly. So the last time that Jesus was near this guy, he was blind. And Jesus puts mud on his eyes and says, go to the pool of Siloam. Jesus didn't go with him. So when he became sighted miraculously, Jesus wasn't there. They said, where is he? And what does he say? Look at verse 12. Where is he? He said, I don't know. Now, here's the question. Why did they bring him to the Pharisees?
Because in the law, when a person is healed, they have to give an offering.
There's that, but the real reason they bring him to the Pharisees is because this is a miracle of the Messiah. This is an unexplainable miracle that Jesus cured a guy born blind. So they said, hey, we need to get some spiritual opinion here. So we're going to take him to the Pharisees. They brought him to the Pharisees, verse 13, the man who was formerly blind. Now here's the killer. It was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. So what's the issue with it being the Sabbath?
Made clay, then he was working.
Immediately they go to the fact that, hey, he cured a guy again on the Sabbath. Okay. First time he cured him, didn't do a thing. He just said, you're cured. This time he does something.
Yeah.
Let's see what the reaction is. Now it was the Sabbath 14, and he made the clay. Then the Pharisees who were asking him again, now they're talking to the guy who's been cured, how he received his sight. And again, that's the second question, how? And he said, I don't know. He applied the clay to my eyes and I washed and I see. It's a very simple testimony. He doesn't understand and he doesn't even try to go into any kind of spiritual or scientific explanation of what happened to him. He just says, I don't know what happened to me, but I do know that the issue has been taken care of with what Jesus did. Read 16 and 17.
Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him, since he opened your eyes? And he said, he is a prophet.
This is interesting because some of the Pharisees were saying he's not of God. Others were saying, how can he not be from God when he's doing such signs? When Nicodemus came to him, he said, we know that nobody can do the signs you do, a Secret Service saint. Nicodemus is basically saying, how can a guy do these signs and be a false prophet? You can't do these kind of signs and be a sinner.
Right.
Especially with the sign that it was going to be the sign of Messiah, and they knew it. So they're really pushing back against that. Now let's read very quickly here. He said he's a prophet. So as far as the blind man is concerned, Jesus has been sent by God to heal him, and he's a good man. Now, verse 18, the Jews then did not believe it of him. What's the it? The fact that he was healed, that he had been blind and had received sight, until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. Now, why did they call the parents?
They should know if anybody does. They were there from the beginning.
What was the accusation that the disciples said when they saw him blind from birth?
What did your parents do?
Was it the parents that sinned? So there was an accusation against the parents. Now all of a sudden he's healed. And where do the Pharisees go? They go to the parents who all of his life up to this point, there had been assumptions that it must have been the parents. And now
Okay.
they call the parents to witness, and the parents are having none of it. Look what the parents say. Verse 20 and 21. His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He is of age, and he will speak for himself. And then verse 20, read 22 and 23.
His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, he is of age, ask him.
What's interesting here, the parents were afraid of the Jews because they said, if anybody believes in this Christ, he's going to be put out of the synagogue. This was not fear for the son. This was fear for them, themselves.
Yeah.
Because the son, he wasn't allowed into the synagogue in the first place
He was
because of his
considered
birth defect.
unclean, right?
That's right. So they said, oh, he was born a sinner. So it must be his parents or him that sinned, and now he's an adult. The parents are worried about themselves, not worried about the son. And they fear the Jews because the Jews, and we know by this point in Jesus' ministry, the Jewish leaders now were already resisting Jesus to the point where they said, if somebody believes in Jesus, he's out of the synagogue. Now, who believes in Jesus just a couple of verses ago? Nicodemus.
Yeah.
Nicodemus is staying on the down low because he doesn't want to get kicked out of the synagogue.
Yeah.
So he says things, but he's not saying, I'm a believer. You following the story so far?
Yeah.
And so they said in verse 23, for this reason, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. Let him testify. He's old enough.
So now a second time, they're going to call the man.
Now, the man is going to start to get fed up, and he is going to get snarky. Let's watch this and see the man's reaction to them calling him again. So read 24 down to about 28.
A second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He then answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see.
Now, wait a second. Let's stop there. I have that underlined in red. One thing I do know is that I was blind, now I see. What does that sound familiar to you?
It sounds like Amazing Grace.
Yeah, that's where John Newton got this idea of I was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see.
Yeah.
That comes right out of this. The sinner, this guy, basically says, hey, I don't know all the theology. I don't know the explanation. I can't argue with you Pharisees on this. All I know is that I used to be blind and now I can see.
The greatest things I've heard have come out of brand new Christians.
Yeah.
Most profound things said.
Yeah, now he goes on. So keep reading verse 26 on.
They said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? This-
I could just see him rolling his eyes going, look, I've explained this to you before. What did he? I don't know what he did. And why are you keeping asking me? Do you guys want to become a believer in him? So he's being very snarky to the Pharisees because he's had it. There,
I,
I tell you, and you're just not listening. So why do you want to know more? That it's actually funny, the verses.
it is funny.
Now, reviled him. Now read from verse 28 on, and we'll just stop you as you go here.
They reviled him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses."
Now, why did they bring up Moses? Let's look back at chapter 8, verse 33.
That's what I was just thinking. That. So we are Abraham's descendants,
What do they say? They're saying
now
we're
servants of
Moses'
Moses.
descendants. Why did they switch from Abraham to Moses?
And Moses at that time gave the law.
That's right. And it goes to verse 29. We know that God has spoken to Moses, and that was the
Oh.
law. But as for this man, we do not know where he is from. And the blind man answered and said in verse 30, here is an amazing thing that you do not know where he is from, and yet he healed me of a messianic sign. It's amazing that they still don't know where he's from because he has cured a man born blind. Now, read from 31 down to 34. Remember, this is the blind man speaking now.
Yeah.
Okay.
We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he bears him.
Okay.
Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind.
See right there. He's basically saying this is only a miracle that could be done by the Messiah. And look, God doesn't do miracles from sinners. But if anyone is God-fearing, he hears him. Since the beginning of time, nobody has healed a man born blind.
Wow.
And then he continues, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So that's his testimony. He's really fed up with their disbelief. He's saying, you guys see that I can see, and you don't believe. You hear what I say, that it was Jesus, and you don't believe. And now you keep asking me that, and you keep claiming that he's a sinner because you just don't believe. And verse 34, they answered him, you were born entirely in sins. Are you teaching us? So they put him out. It's interesting. They put him out, but they called him in.
They're getting awful.
What they said to him is interesting because they said, you talking to us? You were born entirely in sin. Now, we talk about this. In one way, they're correct that all mankind is born with a sin nature.
Yes.
But that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, you were born doing something bad enough to be blind. So you're saying, like, what does a brand new baby do that deserves to be born blind? What you're saying doesn't make any sense. What they're saying didn't make any sense. But what they're saying is true. And not only was the blind man born in sin, but they were born in sin because they have a sin nature.
Yeah.
The only difference is he believed and is going to take an action. And we're going to see this next week. He believes in Jesus and worships Jesus as a disciple. They hear about Jesus, see what Jesus does, and refuse to believe. So they stay in their sin, and he amazingly is healed of the physical blindness and also the spiritual blindness, and he sees the light of the world. Now, next week, we're going to see Jesus picks up here, and he addresses them, and he goes all the way through into chapter 10 addressing this idea of an unwillingness to believe. Any comments?
I like that he worked on the Sabbath.
Yeah. And he heals people at pools.
Yeah.
That's like, and that'd be like us. We want to minister the gospel. We go where people are. We go to coffee shops because that was the well, where the woman at the well and the pool of Bethsaida and now the pool of Siloam.
Yeah, you hear all the time, like, hey, let's meet at the water cooler at work.
Yeah, that's right. And I think also it's significant that Jesus purposely heals people on the Sabbath because he is really addressing this idea of the law and following the law no matter what happens. These Pharisees are seeing miracles. In fact, here they see a miracle that only Messiah can do. And yet the first thing they're worried about is the Sabbath.
And so I had read before that he was going to heal the blind and the deaf would hear and the lame would walk. But I learned today that it was going to be from birth, which really brings out a lot.
The first guy in the pool of Bethsaida, we don't know if that was from birth or not. It just says for 30 years he couldn't walk. He makes a point.
Yeah.
This guy was born blind. And that's why the disciples asked that question. And that's why the parents were very skittish about being called in to testify. Said, hey, it wasn't us. Okay. So we see some interesting things here of Jesus building this encounter with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are pushing back more and more, and Jesus is pushing back on them more and more, doing the work of God.
And the more they try to catch him, they keep implicating their own self.
And it becomes obvious because the blind men, it was obvious to him that they were not going to believe him no matter what he said, and that they weren't listening to him. So he got disgusted. Basically said, why do you keep asking me these stupid questions? You're not going to believe me anyway. They said, you're his disciple. Yeah, I am.
That's
and we'll
awesome.
see that next week as we go. We've been talking about God's work through the person of his son, Jesus Christ, who he sent. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called Forgetting God's Work in Your Life. It's out of the 8th chapter of the book of Mark, and I think you'll enjoy it. And if you do, hit the subscribe button and the like. That helps us a lot. And listen, we're going to continue in our study next week. And until then, God bless you.